Welcome everybody to our second artist talk of the semester. Our first artist talk was Onward with alumni Jonathan Napini and Katie Orgazelic, and that was moderated by Professor Chloe Erla. And that recording is up on the Esther Prangley Rice Gallery website. This artist talk is for the exhibition Embracing Monotony and Filling the Blanks with David Ross, who graduated in 2010, and Steph Perez, who graduated in 2015. We are going to have an introduction on the history of comics by Dr. Robert Lemieux. So before we turn it over to him, I'll give an introduction to each with a bio. So Robert Lemieux is a scholar and filmmaker, a professor of communication and cinema. His creativity extends beyond filmmaking and includes curating popular museum exhibitions that have focused on comic strips, Caldecott award-winning children's books, circus history, graphic novels forthcoming, and animation history forthcoming. He has collaborated with some of America's most notable museums, including the National Gallery of Art, the Smithsonian Institution, the Whitney Museum of American Art, and the Ringling Circus Museum, and the Erie Carl Museum of Picture Book Art. So welcome to Dr. Robert Lemieux.
Thank you.
And I am hoping everything is recording and fine. I'm just making sure, yes, all right. So, one of our artist panelists is David Ross. He is an artist and an educator in the emerging field of STEAM, which stands for Science, Technology, Engineering, Arts, and Math. After obtaining his MFA from American University, David began mentoring youth in art and technology at the Hirshhorn's Makerspace, Art Lab Plus. David left the Hirshhorn after winning a fellowship to build similar programming at the U.S. Embassy in Korea. While in Korea, David began exploring the prevalent toy culture and expanded on his workshop offerings through VR and animation that he in turn incorporated into his own art practice. Once the fellowship concluded, David began working as the Makerspace manager at Temple University's newly built Charles Library. When not running makerspaces, David spends his time drawing, sculpting, and using emerging technologies to bring these to life. He works closely with the DC comic publication Magic Bullet and the designer toy manufacturer Martian Toys. David has exhibited in both national and international gallery settings and has also been involved in many lowbrow art venues. Currently, he is working on manufacturing his own product based off of the work in this show. Maybe when David talks, he can tell us what the lowbrow art venues are. And then let me make sure we can share our screens. Steph Perez is our third panelist. And in 2015, Steph graduated from McDaniel College with a specialization in graphic design. During her time at McDaniel, she attained a 4.0, achieved departmental honors, and was a 4-year starter on the women's basketball team, garnering several records and accolades. Upon graduation, Steph became a team member of Higher Information Group, where she interned during college. For the past 5 years, she has been honing her skills as a graphic and web designer and has recently been promoted to creative manager. She has spearheaded a number of projects for well-known local companies, restaurants, and organizations, including the Central Pennsylvania Youth Ballet, Lancaster Symphony Orchestra, Art Association of Harrisburg, Greystone Public and Brewhouse, and many more. She is also the owner of her own side business, Fur and Feather, which she established in 2017. Through the use of Instagram, her pet portraits can be found across the USA in 24 states and internationally in 7 countries. Along with her design illustration ventures, Steph is also an active freelance and self-portrait photographer working with a variety of clients for different styled photo shoots. Since 2017, she has been a recurring contractor with Barbizon USA and Barbizon PA for photographing their competitions across the United States, regional events, Girls Life Magazine's Fash Bash, and their premier modeling and acting scouting event, Passport to Discovery, a week-long cruise. In her spare time, Steph enjoys illustrating the antics of the people she loves, lifting weights, and binging Netflix. So welcome to our three panelists. I guess I should introduce myself. I'm Stephen Pearson. I'm the chair of the art department and the director of the Rice Gallery. So what I'd like to do now is welcome our attendees. We have a few in attendance, and we hope that they will have questions later. And if you do have questions, you can ask your questions through the chat window. So we're going to turn it over to Dr. Lemieux, and he is going to share his screen and give us a history of comics.
Thank you, Steve. As Professor Pearson mentioned, he invited me to give a little history of the American comic strip, and that history sort of spans 120 years. So to talk about that history in 15 minutes would be a tad ambitious. So what I think I'll do is just focus on 4 themes that I think resonate or did resonate and have resonated over that 120-year span. And so let me share my screen to get started. And we practiced this earlier. And we're assuming, hey, everybody sees that? I see a nod, yes. Okay, so let's get started then. That quote, 8 pages of iridescent polychromous effulgence that makes the rainbow look like a lead pipe. Sort of a very bombastic and flamboyant quote from none other than William Randolph Hearst, but a very influential point in the history of comic strips, because what he's really talking about is the advent of color in the comics, in the newspaper period, and particularly within the comic strips, and how that daily or that Sunday color supplement that we all sort of become familiar with was very instrumental in newspaper history. And again, we're talking 1896. And the interesting part about that is it sort of speaks to the technology aspect, the advent of the full color press. The popularity of comic strips grows tremendously to the point that comic strip artists are celebrities. And their skills are their talents are widely revered and recognized. And there's even competition among newspapers for stealing away reputable or well-known comic strip artists from one newspaper to the other. And during that time frame, if you were a popular comic strip artist, on Sunday, they would give you an entire page for your strip. So there might be 15 panels. And we'll see a few examples of these later. So that quote, flamboyantly bombastic, is true to William Randolph Hearst, but very influential in terms of the start of sort of the American comic strip. And in the beginning, I see it. Hold on a second. There we go. And so the first theme I want to talk about is, comic strips and social class. Social class being an issue here in 2020. Social class being an issue throughout this 120-year time span of the American comic strip. And if we take a look at this 1904 editorial cartoon, I'm pretty certain if you just added a few modern pieces to it, it would fit in almost to today's time frame with regards to some of the conversations or some of the debates we're having here within American culture. And this lets us know that, the debate we're having here in 2020 about building walls and immigration and so forth isn't new to 2020. That's sort of an issue that 1904, 1920, 1940s, 1960s, and so forth, an ongoing issue. And I think this sort of editorial cartoon sort of speaks to that. And if you think about the very early part of the comic strip, one of the influential strips was known as Hogan's Alley. In the late 1890s, early 1900s, and the influence of the strip is that it's presenting immigrant, working class neighborhood. And the key character is the gentleman right in front in the yellow smock with the word artillery written on it, known as the Yellow Kid. And he's sort of becomes sort of the spokesperson in terms of Hogan's Alley. And there would always be like a political, on occasion, a political comment written on his smock. And the interesting part about the depictions of Hogan's Alley, whether it's this one or whether it's this one, there was always mayhem going on. And it was always children running around. They were barefoot. And for many middle-class Americans, this was an unsightly presentation, and uh, they were sort of concerned about this presentation in the Sunday comic strips. And so it didn't last that long, but at the same time, probably one of the most influential comic strips in comic strip history, in the sense that it's speaking sort of politically in some ways, and is also sort of the immigrant aspects in the early 1900s. The fascinating part is, because middle class America was uncomfortable with this strip, the the artist Richard Alcott created a second strip called Buster Brown, and you can notice right away the distinction between Buster Brown, who has a very much a middle class, upper middle class appearance, as opposed to the previous one that we were looking at, the yellow kid with his outfit standing atop the car, in this case, the automobile. The two are very distinct from each other. And so this strip speaks a little bit more to what would be comfortable for middle class America. And Buster Brown engages in some shenanigans and so forth. But the fascinating part about this strip as well is that Buster Brown becomes the first sort of commercial, highly successful commercial character in advertising in commercial products in the early part of the 20th century. Everything from toys to food products to shoes, Buster Brown shoes, which I think you can still buy Buster Brown shoes today. The second strip I would talk about would be from a social class perspective, and this is a fascinating one, is Blondie. And yes, that's Blondie in that strip, and we probably don't recognize her. Her originations were as a flapper in the late 1920s, early 1930s, and her boyfriend, Dagwood Bumstead, comes from a billionaire family. And the fascinating part about that is there was no such thing as a billionaire in the 1920s or 1930s. And so I think technically the Bumsteads are the first U.S. billionaire family in history. And so it becomes this sort of social class issue where Mr. and Mrs. Bumstead want nothing to do with Blondie. They just don't see her as appropriate girlfriend for their son Dagwood. And this plays out in the strip in the sense that they're always trying to downplay Blondie and sort of make, offer up other suggestions for other women for Dagwood to date. And as the strip plays out, it becomes much more tense. And we get a sense of this with regard to, if you look at these two strips, the first one, the very first panel, goodness gracious me, these rich people. And it's Mrs. Bumstead waking up in the morning and being escorted to her bath. And then you see in the second strip below, the very last panel, you get a sense of what we mean by a bath. It's almost like the size of a pool. And so here we sort of see that sort of social class aspect, upper class, wealthy class American, and the distinction of that in comparison to Blondie. As the strip progresses, Dagwood begins to recognize what his parents are trying to do. So he decides to go on a hunger strike. And this plays out in the newspaper for 28 days. And America becomes riveted as Dagwood is confessing or showcasing his love for Blondie by going on a hunger strike. And his parents will not relent. This goes on until we get to day 28, where, the doctor has to step in and say, look, you need to relent so that your son can have some food. So after 28 days, Dagwood wins and his parents give in, and he's allowed to marry Blondie, and their wedding in 1933 becomes one of the biggest cultural events in America in 1933. Everybody is tuning in. And the interesting part, and I don't know if you can see this, but you can see in the background, Mrs. Bumstead sort of seated a little bit behind Blondie there in that middle panel. And she's saying, even on the wedding day, what a pity. So it carries forth right up to the wedding day, this sort of clash between Mr. and Mrs. Bumstead and the flapper Blondie. Now, the downside of getting married is that Dagwood is cut off from the family inheritance and is relished or is destined to live sort of a middle-class life for the rest of his life. Right? And so those are kind of two examples of that sort of social class being played out in the comic strips. And the second thing I want to talk about is the prevalence of race in comic strips and how that is carried forth throughout the 20th century. And the interesting part is there's this sort of, throughout much of the 20th century, an entire parallel universe known as the Black press, where Black America has their own newspapers. And starting in about the 1940s, 1950s, definitely the 1940s, they start to carry color supplements on Sunday, which would be very similar to the color supplements that we would see in mainstream newspapers. They have their own comic strip artists. They have their own notable characters, and these characters are doing many of the same things that you might see in the white comic strip pages. Namely, there's science fiction heroes, there are Western heroes, there are adventure heroes, there are drama types comic strips. So it's almost like there's an entire parallel universe of the Black press, not only with traditional news, but on Sundays creating, replicating, in this case, Black comic strips. And many of these newspapers, Black press newspapers, were very direct in terms of their concerns or the issues confronting America during that time frame. You would never see any of this in the white press, but within the Black press, there were very notable editorials that spoke directly to the struggles of Black America, particularly with race. And I think these are two excellent examples. The one on the left, Oliver Harrington, is probably one of the most well-known Black editorial cartoonists in the 20th century. And so, their voices were central to the readers of the Black press. As we moved forward into like the latter part of the 20th century, we started to see Black characters show up in mainstream newspapers, the white press. And two that sort of stand out initially is a strip called We Pals, which was actually drawn by a Black artist, male. And it really didn't have a tremendous following until the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. And once that event occurred, everybody sort of started, looking a little bit more inward culturally about ourselves, and the spotlight started sort of shone on We Pals, and particularly Maury Turner, and the way in which he had been presenting children of color. And the interesting part is the children aspect is sort of very key in the sense that children were very safe presentation for the most part. You didn't see any adult Black characters. The white press was very comfortable with sort of presenting children. It was sort of a safe thing to present. And on the right, we have sort of the introduction of Black character in Peanuts, Franklin. Although even the introduction of Franklin in a very well-known comic strip like Peanuts created a little bit of controversy, particularly within the southern part of the United States. A number of newspapers sort of declined to run any Peanut strips that involved Franklin during the 1960s and the early part of the 1970s. Another character that was sort of groundbreaking in the 1970s was Lieutenant Flap in Beetle Bailey. He becomes the first adult Black character in mainstream newspapers. And he's very in your face, as you can sort of tell in that very initial strip. That's his introduction, that black and white one at the top. And that second panel where he's very forceful in his presence, right? And even in the bottom strip, the color one, where instead of the normal salute you would get in the Army, he helps out the general in terms of the Black Power movement. And similar to Peanuts, this character, Lieutenant Flap, was controversial, particularly among some of the more conservative areas of the southern United States. Even the Pentagon had issues with this. It was banned from Stars and Stripes newspaper, which is a newspaper for the armed services. And there was such a backlash against that by the soldiers that the Pentagon had to relent, and it was back in print. The one sort of fascinating part is that here, this sort of adult character, Mort Walker, who is the creator of Belly, received quite a bit of email from Black America about how to present Lieutenant Flat, the degree to which how his afro should be, how his style should be, how he should talk. So there was a great connection between the comic strip and Black America and the introduction of this Black character. There was also even a Mexican presence with a strip called Gordo, which ran from the early 1940s to the mid 80s. And this was like the only strip with sort of a Mexican Hispanic theme to it. And it was influential in terms of introducing a number of Americans to certain aspects of Mexican culture. Highly influential comic strip during that time period. If we move sort of forward in time to today, picking up sort of the mantle of the Hispanic cause is Lalo Alcaraz, who does a strip called La Cucaracha. And he is very, as evident by this strip, he's very in your face with regards to the issues of the day that are confronting many sort of Hispanics in US culture. And he's sort of a known voice for Hispanic culture. Similarly, Darren Bell, who speaks, who does both editorial cartoons and a comic strip. And I think this sort of editorial cartoon, when you read the sort of bottom of it, has a pretty good valid point or speaks to some of the issues occurring within Black America today. So the issue of race, has resonated since the beginning of the dawn of comic strips. And, this is just sort of a brief sample, both within the white press and the Black press. You could spend an entire half of a semester of a course really studying the depiction of race within US comic strips. The sort of third theme I would want to look at, and one again that resonates here in the 21st century, is the image of the female, because we're talking about an industry that is predominantly male-oriented, white male-oriented for easily the first 50, 60 years of its existence. Even female comic strips, strips that were featured female characters like Blondie, were drawn by white males, right? And in the early part of the 20th century, most depictions of females where there was actually a female artist were of this type. And this is by Nell Brinkley, who created what were known as the Brinkley Girls. And they were all the rage in the 1920s, sort of speaking to feminism, speaking to women's power, and so forth. And she was a highly influential artist with regard to her depiction of women in the early part of the 20th century. To be a female artist in the industry, if you weren't a Nell Brinkley, one of the strategies you might pursue would be using a pseudonym. And we have two excellent examples here. Dahlia Messick, who went by the name Dale Messick, and June Mills, who used the pseudonym Tarp Mills to sort of hide the fact that they were female. And getting the opportunity to create their own characters. Dale Messick, who created a reported character named Brenda Starr, becomes very influential in the second half of the 20th century. And Tarp Mills, very similarly, she creates sort of an adventure, crime-fighting female character. But the only way they're sort of able to do this is to strategically sort of, as best they can, hide their identity. At some point, obviously, it becomes obvious to everybody that these are two females. But by the time it's evident to everybody, they've reached a point where their work is in print and they're having a successful career. A third sort of example, or another example, might be a strip called Mopsy by a woman named Gladys Parker. And she approached it from very much a fashion perspective. And here's what I think are two good examples in terms of her main character was always sort of emphasizing women's fashion, to the point that she ended up creating her own fashion line due to the success of her comic strip. But I think this is a pretty good example of how the types of things that women were allowed to do with regard to a comic strip. They were sort of very narrow limits on the types of issues they could address, the types of characters that they could create, and so forth in that early part of the 20th century. And it really wasn't until, well, actually, I should stop. It really wasn't until the latter part of the 20th century where women had greater flexibility with regard to some of the issues they could address. This is an example of, in the Black press, a Black female artist called Jackie Ormes, who had a very, very influential strip called Torchy and Heartbeats. Torchy Goes to Harlem. And it sort of mirrored the Great Migration of a young African-American woman moving from the South to New York City to pursue the dream of a better life. And this strip ran in, I think, the Chicago Defender, which is that, or the Pittsburgh Courier, which was one of the premier Black press newspapers. And she's the first Black female to have the opportunity to draw a comic strip. Now, again, you would have had to be a reader of the Black press to know that this strip existed. Highly influential. And again, it sort of tracked or followed the Great Migration. And then moving forward into sort of the latter part of the 20th century, the first nationally syndicated Black female, in other words, in mainstream newspapers, was a strip called Where I'm Coming From, which detailed the lives of Black females. And the interesting part is Barbara Brandon Croft, who created the strip, her father was Brumsick Brandon, who was one of the influential comic strip artists in the 1930s, 1940s for the Black press. So sort of a family legacy there. But her strip was very unique and spoke to Black females and the struggles that they encountered in the early and mid 1990s. And then, of course, sort of a classic, Kathy, by Kathy Geiswhite. And it's a pretty good quote. I wasn't aware that when the strip started, there had never been a woman's voice quite like this in the newspaper. Because when Kathy first started, she was very much a feminist, very political, very outspoken about the needs of women, the place of women in America, and so forth. And there really wasn't another strip that sort of did it, that sort of had the voice that Kathy had. And then sort of rounding out this idea of women, I thought this was a pretty good editorial cartoon with regard to some occasional perception we have of women, the cultural perception, the cultural presentation. And this is by a female artist, Signe Wilkinson. And I thought this sort of was an appropriate commentary about some of the issues that women face, particularly in the political world. Right? And so, again, that the notion of women's place within comic strips, and not just comic strips, but culturally throughout the 20th century, definitely shifted. And I think comic strips illustrated that in terms of the rise of women and the power of women throughout the 20th century with regard to comic strip industry. The final aspect, since this is the art department after all, is comic strips and art, because this is an artistic endeavor. And one of the things that comic strip artists are consistently dealing with is their art being manipulated. And so here's a great example of that. It's the same comic strip. The difference is that the comic strip on the left is all 9 panels. The comic strip on the right has been edited to sort of fit that newspaper. And in being edited, the newspaper decided to omit the first 3 panels, namely the title panel, and then the first 2 panels of dialogue. And you might say to yourself, well, are you really missing anything without those first 2 panels of dialogue? But if you're the artist of this, you might have certainly a different perspective, in the sense that, you're shortening me with regard to the art that I have created. And if you think about, one of the key issues that the originator of Calvin and Hobbes, I'm drawing a blank on his name, one of the reasons he stepped away from the industry was this very reason, that the degree to which his art was being manipulated, and not just him, a variety of artists sort of have this concern as well, the degree to which their art is manipulated, whether it's shrunk in size or whether we're removing panels altogether. And from an artistic perspective, I mean, I could provide numerous examples, but I just sort of want to highlight a few. Here's a sort of a classic, Little Nemo in Slumberland by a gentleman named Winsor McCay, who is revered in the comic strip industry for his artistic presentation. And this is also an excellent example of him being provided the entire page to present his art, as opposed to a quarter of the page or half of the page. Very much a revered artist, and all of his strips sort of look like this. Amazing, amazing amount of detail and sort of color and art. And again, here's an excellent full page example. Even something like Gasoline Alley, which is sort of a rather sort of conservative oriented comic strip. And here we are in the early 1930s, where it almost kind of has that Art Deco look to it. And you can sort of see, the artist, Frank King in this case, trying to present more of an artistic presentation to his comic strip. Or maybe something like Polly and Her Pals, which sort of is art mimicking art. Here we have an older gentleman going to an exhibit of modern art, and he's just sort of shocked at what he sees and how, in terms of what art has become, what the modern world has done to art. And as he exits the exhibit, you can see the bottom row, that bottom left panel, he's just dizzy. And then he sees sees a woman that speaks more to a sort of classical presentation of women in art, and he's just happy to see that. And so if you look at the detail in this, just the amount of detail on those first 4 panels at the top, or even those middle panels at the bottom, or in the center row, all of this would be in ink. And the degree to which, you would do this just for one day, that all the work involved here is just going to be for a Sunday panel, and it's just going to be one day. Keeping in mind that, a comic strip artist works, their work shows up 7 days a week. Another example of, and this would be an original, right? Black and white. So here's an original, Terry and the Pirates, which was a popular strip in the 1940s, and by Milton Caniff, widely respected. And if you look at that bottom 4 panels, you can sort of see the detail work there. And again, this is all in ink. And again, one day. This is one day. This is going to show up for one day, and that's going to be it. And you can just, if you look closely at this, I don't think looking at it in a PowerPoint does it any justice. But when you look at the original of this, there's a tremendous, tremendous amount of detail in here. Same with something like Prince Valiant. This is also an original, also ink, also one day. This would be for, I'm guessing, a Sunday strip. And this would get sent to the printer, whether it's Terry and the Pirates or Prince Valiant, this would get sent to the printer with color notations in terms of where to place the color, and then the printer would toss in the color at the newspaper. So not only are you drawing it in pen and ink, but you are also offering up the color notations as well. And here's what it would look like. Here's a good example of a Buck Rogers piece from the 1930s. In terms of, and again, full page. So here's a full page Buck Rogers, a Sunday strip. And you can certainly see the vividness in terms of the color and the layout of a strip of this sort. Or perhaps something like this, also a full page Sunday strip. There's a heck of a lot of work involved there. Crazy Cat, which is, we could spend an entire conversation just about the influence of this strip. In fact, Crazy Cat, they did a Crazy Cat retrospective at the Reina Sofia Museum in Madrid 2 years ago. And the reason they did that was because Picasso was a huge, huge fan of Crazy Cat comic strips. And Picasso, obviously being from Spanish region of Spain, and this Reina Sofia having quite a few pieces of Picasso, they sort of did an exhibit presenting Crazy Cat as an influence of, or influencing Picasso. And I think they had like 145 or 150 pieces of Crazy Cat art up on the walls. Miss Fury, which we sort of looked at earlier, by Tarp Mills, the color involved here. her adventure strip, female adventure strip, the use of color. Gordo, which we spoke about earlier. Here you sort of have that sort of, looks very 1950s-ish presentation. And then here's an interesting example of art imitating art. At the top we have Early Sunday Morning, the classic Edward Hopper painting. And then the bottom we have Brian Walker, the artist for a comic strip called High and Lois, sort of using that as part of his strip. And it'd be interesting how many readers would have recognized this as art imitating art, as this replicating Edward Hopper's original painting. And I thought that was kind of a unique approach as well. And then lastly, just to sort of sum it up, Gary Trudeau, Hand Me the Comics, will you? That's kind of what I have. A very short tour of comic strips, thematically speaking, quickly, because I want to save time for our two true stars, David and Steph. And I'll turn it over to Steve. And if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer any questions at some point. But thank you very much.
Yeah, there are a couple of questions, but we'll save them until after David.
Okay.
So anybody that still wants to ask questions of either Dr. Lemieux or David and Steph, just add them to the chat, and we'll start with those once we get to the question and answer period. So I'm going to start with Steph, and then we'll go to David. So Steph will share her screen and some of the work from that's on the website, and talk to us about the work that's in the show. I will mute myself.
All right. Okay. Let me start. Oh, okay. Can everybody see the screen? Okay. And you can hear me. Perfect. Okay. So I'm going to have the work up here on the side, but I kind of want to start with an overview and kind of speak generally about the work, and I'll kind of refer back to it at some point throughout, and I'll kind of like scroll up and down just so you can see the other ones throughout. But kind of going from an overview point, looking at this entire body of work, to be honest, it was accidental. It wasn't intentional. And after graduating college, hold on, I want to just fix this real quick. What is going on? I'm sorry. Give me 1 second. There we go. Okay. So yeah, it was an accidental body of work. And after graduating college, I, was still illustrating, because that's kind of what I did for my senior show at McDaniel in 2015. I was illustrating for fun in my spare time, but there wasn't an intention to create a body of work such as this. But going into the first Christmas after graduating college, I wanted to give my coworkers, who are the stars of, this body of work, gifts for Christmas. But I'm going to be candid throughout this entire thing. I was a big cheapo then, and I'm still a cheapo now. And I wanted to give them gifts, but I didn't want to purchase anything. So I came up with a good idea to give them illustrations, because that was kind of my forte, and it's free to do that. And we were all close friends, and we always poked fun at each other. So I thought it would be a neat idea to kind of make fun of them as Christmas gifts, and highlight some of the most memorable and inappropriate comments and stories from that year. So that very first year, which one of them from that first year, these were all subsequent years. I'm going to find one so you can see kind of the difference. This was one from the very first year. They were very small. They were only like 3x4-inch cards. They were simple. But my coworkers, they absolutely loved them. It was the biggest hit. They didn't even care that I didn't pay for it. They just loved it. So the following Christmas, I decided to do the same thing. And obviously I had a whole nother year under my belt. So there was more memories, more experiences, and the illustrations became even more elaborate and stylized. And as you can see, there's a slight difference, which I'll talk about later. But I did start doing them digitally, if you couldn't tell that there was a difference from that first time to the next one. So, with that and how much they loved it, every year since that point, I continued to do the gifts. And they really took a life of their own. And it morphed into this method of documentation where I was literally taking notes while working. If we had a funny conversation, I was jotting them down in a Word document every single day, so that I could pull all the amazing memories from the year and make these illustrations. And, you know, they were very aware of the magnitude of the documentation I was doing through the year, and they would joke and crack jokes and call me a creeper and say I was like this alien taking notes on humans on Earth. And it was funny. It was an internal joke, but that kind of moves into the content that is behind it. As you can see, it's my coworkers, it's the stories and the conversations we had. So while there wasn't intentionality behind it, it morphed into something with significance, and it kind of not full society representation, but it represented the work environment. You know, I've been at the same job for 5 years, and it was an adjustment when I first went into the workforce. You know, the job itself wasn't the problem. It was the idea of sitting at the same desk for the rest of my life that affected, you know, my frame of mind. You know, we're at our jobs day in, day out, 40 hours a week, and it can be draining, you know, for some people. And we spend time with the same people more than our own families. So you either kind of hate them, which makes work terrible. You feel indifferent, which also just makes work. Or, you know, you become friends and family and invest in these people, and you love being there because of them. So don't get me wrong, I love my coworkers before the caricatures began, but when I started doing these illustrations and documenting them and giving them these gifts, it shifted my mindset, because documenting these moments, you know, they created the opportunity to be fully present in the moment, to actively engage with my coworkers, and, you know, for us to be candid and open and just have wild and inappropriate conversations that fueled these drawings. Like everything in them, you know, is representative of those stories. So by taking these conversations and turning them into these graphic illustrations, they really made the memories physical and solidified their humorous nature. You know, each joke, you know, everyone that's in a bubble is elaborate story behind it. It doesn't maybe mean much to you, but it just triggers these memories. And every component of the illustration, the outfit, the props, if there are any, the poses, they all carry meaning. And to the eye, for someone who didn't experience that moment, doesn't mean much, but they do have meaning. And so, like, particularly this one that's on the screen now, it's kind of difficult to tell from the illustration, but he's wearing a sailor uniform. And during that year, we had done baby pictures in our newsletter to guess who the baby was. And his baby picture, he had on a little sailor outfit, and we made fun of him relentlessly for it. And then it's also difficult to tell, but these are sweat pit stains. We would openly joke about pitting. That it's childish, some of it, but it was all in good fun. And I remember every single story connected to it. And I could go on. And if you look through these on your own computer and you're like, what does that little ghost mean? I can tell you the story behind it, because there certainly is a good one. But anyways, I'm kind of going on a tangent there, kind of drilling back to the meaning of them. You know, more often than not, a full-time job is viewed as monotonous, arduous, repetitive. But I think this body of work kind of represents embracing that environment and truly investing in the people around you. And when you do that, and when you open yourself up to that versus just being like a robot in a place doing your job, it transforms your perspective. And, you know, these characters, they are characters in these drawings, but they're real life people. And when I look at them, you know, I view those people as my brothers and sisters, people who are going to be lifelong friends. Some of them I don't work with anymore, but they truly have become lifelong friends. And this is just little snapshots of the time being with them. And kind of what's neat about it is, I feel, from my point of view, it's kind of reminiscent of The Office, you know, the TV show. I don't know who watches it and who doesn't. But when I saw that when I was younger, I was like, I hope I work somewhere like that. Like, that looks kind of fun, all the joking, all the pranks. And to an extent, I'm not saying we were like the TV show, but I feel like a little bit, because our work environment was very lax, anything kind of went, we were allowed to be free. It just kind of represents that. So segueing from that and the style and the meaning behind it, the medium I chose and the stylistic choices I made throughout it are embodies the overtop and kind of very obviously cartoon nature of everything going on during these. All the things being said, it's all cartoonish. It's all ridiculous. So that's really kind of at the core of that. But kind of what I hinted at earlier, the first Christmas in 2015, I did the first batch of illustrations on small 4x3 cards, and I drew them with ink, which was very reflective of the medium I was devoted to in college, and had used exclusively for my senior capstone and departmental honor show. I love drawing in ink. Steve can attest to that. But in 2016, I got an iPad, an Apple Pencil, which completely changed everything for me. Obviously, that's the source for my side business. I draw everything on my iPad. I make money using it, but I decided to draw the gifts using my iPad instead, which allowed for more detail and without messing up with ink. And although I adapted and adopted a new method, it's still very reflective of my signature cartoonish style, and I still stuck with this almost simulated ink effect because I love working in black and white. So I just wanted to kind of stay true to that. And kind of, I'm heading toward the end of me talking, but I have a little bit more. Talking about it being cartoonish, being comic, like, that's where my influence is drawn from. Growing up, I was a huge fan of comics, cartoons, and graphic novels, and I still very much am. So I would always draw nonstop and kind of pull inspiration from all of these elements. I would look at like comic book drawing books that would teach me stuff. So you can see that that's kind of carried through, but I've morphed it into my own little cartoonish style. And yeah, so that's kind of the style side. But another big influencer for me was taking the creative nonfiction honors course my junior year of college, which was also the big influencer of my senior show too, because it changed the course of my creative approach. It was a class about writing memoirs creatively, taking simple, mundane things and writing them completely in a new way. So that served as inspiration for my senior show, which was about video games affecting my life and the stories connected to it. And clearly, I'm using it here as well, because I've definitely found a super immense passion in illustrating mundane things and funny stories connected to it. Because, not only do I give the gifts to my coworkers, but I do the same thing for my boyfriend. Anytime we have a silly conversation, I say something stupid to him and he makes fun of me, I'll draw it and give it to him as a gift. I just do it all the time. It's so much fun. But I don't know if I'm talking fast, but to wrap it up, I still have all the notes that I took for 3 years. Yeah, I took 3 years full of notes, hundreds of pages of obscure notes that I don't have any clue what half of it means anymore. So I'm gonna just sit there and decipher it like a different language because they're just quick little notes. But I hope one day to take it using the same style from just these little gifts that I gave, and create an actual graphic novel that tells, the story of my time at Higher Information Group. Because it's definitely a memorable one, and you don't even know all the dramatic parts. So it could be the most crazy graphic novel you've ever read in your life. And that's kind of it.
All right. So hopefully we get to see that graphic novel at some point. All right, so our last speaker is David, and I'm hoping Zoom doesn't kick us off right at 8 o'clock. So we'll keep a watch on that, David. So I'll turn it right over to you.
I kind of hope it does. That would be such a good ending, right? I don't know if I can follow you two up. That was good. Hold on. I wanted to get your view, actually. I think this is better. So let me go to the bottom. I really liked, Robert, what you were saying about technology and sort of the business side of comic books is something I'm very much into, as well as you mentioned manipulating comics. And what I really like is stuff I really go after, for some context of what I'm going to talk about, is sort of like the outsider comic book stuff. These small grassroots organizations who have zero rules as far as what's allowed and what's not allowed. And also because of, modern printing and stuff, are able to do this on their own and actually make close to what you'd find in a store sort of books. And it's very similar to what I like about toys, which I'll also get into. But that's a really good segue into the first thing I'm going to talk about, my BART and Data project. I pulled up this website. It's called BART Cura. What BART Cura is sort of a amalgamation of American and or America's and Japanese sort of cross pollination that happened. They took the comic book Akira, which is sort of made, or not comic book, manga rather, and it sort of popularized that style in the US, and it really kickstarted that's the us engaging sort of in Japanese manga. And so this group randomly began making their own comic book that follows the Akira, but does it with The Simpsons. And what I like so much about it is there's a consistent story, but no consistent art style whatsoever, right? So as you go through, it makes sense, but it's like, it's a really perfect way of capturing kind of, something like 200, 300 different comic book cultures from all over the world coming together to make this singular book. So there's 5 issues, and each one they choose someone to do sort of like a special project. And so I did their 5th one. At the time I was working at the Smithsonian, and I was living in a closet for the most part, so I didn't have much room to work. And I contacted them, because I've been following BART Cura forever, asking to do comic book pages, and they already had them taken up. But they looked at my portfolio and they said, hey, you could do a cover, and we also have this project to make a toy. So this is a 1-foot toy that was made in Japan, and I worked with a 3D printing company called Brule. And the way I did this is actually kind of clever. Again, I was trying to get out of my closet, and I only had that scanner. So I'd contact different friends, and I'd go visit them and 3D scan them in this very specific pose, wearing clothing that I kind of like matched to what Akira was. I think there was some actual like Thriller Michael Jackson Halloween costume in here a little bit. But this, like, the comic book is kind of just an amalgamation of like a ton of different people, all kind of in the same stance. And I went further and actually grabbed some stuff like the head that I added teeth, and I sort of aged from a video game, a 3D video game. And the hair I took from the comic book, scanning the pages and stuff, and then some of the decals or whatever on the shirt were also taken from the BART Cura, like other artists doing it. So I just appropriated everything. I mean, I like just grabbed everything I could and threw it into this toy. And this is kind of my first start into designer toys. And the reason I like it so much is, I like love artists and their main work always, but when you find stuff that's outside of what they make, a good example is like Oliphant or Daumier, right? You see these sculptures they make, these cartoonists who make sculptures, and it's like so cool. It's such a good way to sort of view into their work habits and whatnot. So I made that. They printed it and finished it with an acetone sort of vapor process. So this is actually printed in, ABS, like just regular, kind of like Lego plastic. So it has that polished look. I did it in 2 parts so the head articulates and all that. And I also did their cover. So this is the 5th issue cover. It's the exact same as the manga, but I just basically bought some Simpsons Legos and rebuilt the scene. again, I didn't have much space, so I was like on my table doing this like really bad green screen, and a lot of Photoshop effect there. But if you would actually go back and look, you can see, just like the comic itself, they take about 5 of their of the covers from artists, and then they kind of like mishmash them together, which is pretty cool. And it kind of sums up the whole project. So that was sort of my first introduction to designer toys, specifically designer toys, like the title of that. But I went to Korea, as Steve mentioned in the bio, and I very, very quickly began researching them because they were everywhere. I mean, like toy culture in general is sort of all over Asia, I think, like in all the shops and whatnot. So I decided I wanted to mimic kind of the Dunny toy. There's this toy called a Dunny, Dunnies and Monies by Paul Bundes. It's by the Kid Robot that sort of took what was happening in Asia initially and then popularized it in America by making a blank platform that everyone could buy and repurpose and sell. So, you know, that's what this guy is right here. It's just my my own version of a blank where I took my toe and I cut off the base and I just kind of stuck it on the head. It's like brilliant. But I'm actually jumping forward a little bit. These are out of order, Steve. I'm just kidding. Let me go to the sculptures if I can find them. Yeah, so these are the actual characters right here. Right, so there's five of them. I took my best friend's foot and I like separated his toes and I 3D scanned his toes. And with that, I used 3D modeling to kind of, each one had a very distinct look. Like you could look at that and be like, I know that is the index toe, right? So I took that and I kind of modeled them and changed them ever so slightly, like tweaking and tweaking until like they kind of had their own characteristics. And so what I ended up with was Twum, Twindex, Twiddle, Twing, and Twinkie, right? Which is a sort of a joke my brother used to tell when I was growing up. He'd always call the toes that. I found out later that's not actually true, but I'm gonna make it true by making these things. And this is kind of a second or third iteration. You know, I initially made these right actually before going to Korea. If we look at the old models, you'll notice like the very first ones I made were about, you know, here's one, it's about this big, super tiny. They're actually the size of toes. And you'll see that thing, like there's certain differences. Like this Twum only has 1 foot, right? Twing always had a ring on it, which I got rid of. Of course, it's a blank that other people are supposed to customize or I'm supposed to customize. That just adds too much character trait to it. And so I had to get rid of it in the later iterations. Twiddle, you'll notice the bone is actually coming out of the foot. I didn't give them legs, and the hands, it looks unfinished. And these two I kept the same, right? So, so after making those small ones, I was like 3D printing and I was experimenting with casting, which is really, you know, kind of blows open. Like 3D printing is great, but it's really limiting as far as materials go. So I was experimenting with casting, and I would cast in resin before I began sort of customizing it and modifying it. These toes actually have removable nails, which is nice. I think the idea of being able to like paint a nail, for instance, just adds a certain, it's kind of like My Little Pony with the hair, you know what I mean? For me, I think that's cool. Maybe not everyone does. So these are some of the smaller prints. I still use them in certain sculptures. This was a TV I made by laser cutting. I had to draw out every scene. I kind of thought about it like a stage, right? And you really do have to think in terms of layers and be very good with that. And so I made all these layers, put into Illustrator, did all the design and all that, and basically repainted it once I laser cut it. And it's nice because it's totally modular. I can take off any of the pieces. I can take off the roof and then start putting the characters inside. I can take off the trash can lid and the top of that house. That's very important to me so that you can actually position people. I'm going to skip that one a little bit. But during this time, I was talking about how, I was designing these toes, and when I first made them, I was really upset because I kept trying to paint them, right? I first cast them, they looked great, I assembled them. I was trying to paint them and make cool characters, and it just like was not at all working. I mean, like, I thought I'd be really good at it. I was terrible at it. it was really frustrating to me because I know 3D modeling programs really well. I can draw fine and all that. And for some reason, working on this three-dimensional surface became really challenging. So none of them are actually pictured here. You'll see them on my website and stuff. But the way I figured out how to do it was actually making like characters that you'd recognize, right? Like my Ninja Turtle. So I kind of learned how like the shapes work and stuff by just taking those and doing what 99% of like the designer toy artists are doing, and just kind of making like a Stewie from Family Guy and stuff like that. But it was really, really good, a good way to learn. And also because I was not great at casting, they have these awesome surface defects, the old ones, and so I kind of like incorporated those into the design. The ones on this website are way more polished because I got better, and I redesigned them and all that. But while doing that, another thing that I always do while working on these characters is draw comics just to figure them out, figure out their personalities. I have no idea, honestly, where this one in particular came from. A lot of times I just, like Steph was saying, like you just got to keep drawing. So I started drawing this, and then I realized I, had to do the next page and the next page, and it just kind of went. Along those lines, the dialogue is almost nonsensical to the point it's really confusing. I think that's mainly because I kind of like write very loose like thoughts inside these dialogue boxes, and then later when I'm doing the final step, which is using a tablet, right? I'm just like, oh, okay, this kind of makes sense. I'm like writing in the dialogue. This is all pen and ink, of course. And it just follows this like clown who's cut off his polydactyly, which is your sixth toe, or I think so. And all these toes, or he cut off all his toes, they all escaped or something. There's a polydactyly. It's very dire. Anyway, so yeah, I draw all these comics. But before I did that, I was actually doing an individual one of each comic. A lot of these were published in like Magic Bullet or Trip 10, like a Canadian comic book. But I would do it the same sort of method where I don't have much of a story. I just like kind of draw and then I fill in the blanks. But I did one focused on every single character, right? So one on Twinkie, of course, and then whoever is in the rest of the title is the other characters that happen to be in there. So this is him with the humans, right? A bunch of the toes with Twing. And this one's probably my favorite. One reason being, a lot of times I'll make like landscapes. So there's an actual sort of like scene, like what I was talking about with the way I do stages and plays, that if you look closely, like with the fence and stuff, or like the way the grass is here and here, you can actually follow sort of like an actual space, right? So we know that this takes place within like, 100 feet or something. I like that. And this was the first one I did. I think this is like the funniest thing I've ever drawn. Just the idea of like a Twum drinking at a bar and someone getting angry that he's smoking. He just stands up on the table and yells, "I am Twum." For some reason, that's like, I think that's like kills me every time. I just quit smoking, and that's why this is all about like smoking. And it's just I was so angry, and I was like just throwing ink on a page, as I recall. This is an example of like a really early one, right? So if we look closely, you'll see Twum. This was before I gave him a second foot, and he originally just kind of hopped around, but I changed that. Twintex's nail is a little shorter, actually. And again, this one, it's like he has those claws. Twiddle, who's the angry toe, he's the middle toe, of course. But he has these claws, and you'll see the bone that came out when he popped off the foot are all different. And Twing has a ring right there. You'll notice, actually, if I go back to the actual physical toes, you see how I changed that? I gave them, so each one of those fingers are actually the same character, just like shortened. Same with all of them, like it's the same toe for the feet, right? So I completely changed that character and kind of gave him like hands. You can do so much more like expressive stuff with hands and feet. Anyways, I digress. I did large technical drawings of them. A lot of this stuff was during COVID, so as you can imagine, I was just sitting there like, whatever, I'm just gonna like draw when I'm supposed to be working. So I banged out just so much work during that time. More ways of figuring them out. Actually, a lot of it was like figuring out bone placement and also kind of like the wiggle lines of like how they would move. Twing sings apparently. And then I decided to move on. So like I've gotten to the point with these that, you know, I've made like packaging. I've basically perfected the casting process. Like I can do it almost perfectly. That I want to try to get them in vinyl. So I'm stepping back from that because that's all like I sit at a computer and like do emails and stuff. And I started focusing on new characters, which are actually technically really old characters. Because I was drawing this character a lot when I was in Steve's class in undergrad. But I began thinking of it kind of when I was drawing the comics of the toes, you know, like I wanted populations. But I don't want to draw, I don't want to draw like just people. That bores me. So instead I decided to just strip away the character of everything. This drawing you're seeing is kind of like an undersketch. And therefore I'm able to do it incredibly quickly, these undersketches. And I got rid of the eyes and just filled them with stuffing. So that's my next project going forward, is just like a humanoid plush, which I think would be really fun. But it's also incredibly fun to draw, right? This one is the idea of like, you know, this guy's pretty strange if you saw a toe standing in the street and they're all pointing at it, but they're also in the exact same position and they're spilling out fluff. Yeah, so to figure these out, kind of, I just began drawing more and more, just massive amounts of them. The drawings were getting quite big as well. So, you know, this is 27 by 25, but there's like a 10-footer in here somewhere. That one was really fun to draw. I use color very sparingly with these. A lot of times I'm also making the sort of backgrounds and stuff very simple, right? So like this was just purely about the circle and the sort of oval that was their eye. And they're like exploding off. I think, ooh. And I also included this one because this was technically an older version. This actually gives good context. This was another magic bullet, but it gives good context to what the character became, right? When I was kind of actually adding hair, kind of like mine and like all the clothing and stuff. And it's essentially the same guy, I just like threw everything out. Another reason I like this drawing so much is because I get annoyed when things look really technical, right? I find that kind of boring. And so I was drawing a lot of this with my left hand to try to lose control. But by the end, I actually got really good with drawing with my left hand. And I kind of lost the ability to like, you know, get that like this upper plant panel just looks so awesome because it's like I have zero control over what I'm doing, I think. Yeah. And that goes into everything also. It's like I can only have like the digital aspect so far. You know, I think one reason that like these work, even though this is technically digital, right? This rainbow in the background is digital, but it looks very hand drawn. And so it really stretches those, at least if I'm gonna pat myself on the back, I think it stretches those two sides really well, as do like toes, right? The idea of having something that's 3D scan that's from life and sort of like digitized. So it kind of confuses the brain, which I really like. I'm like out of things to talk about, Steve.
Perfect, because then we can get to some questions. Before, there are a couple of questions in the chat, but just a minor observation, and Dr. Lemieux might know of this artist, but when you were, David, when you were showing the work that you said was kind of after doing the toes, it was, maybe I can pull it up. So I'm not just, and let me go, wait, current exhibition, sorry, I'll get there. And this is a lot of this for just a quick little offshoot comment. So I apologize. And I'm trying to get to the work. It's down here. So this this stuff, this work here, especially these, make me think of Rose O'Neill's Cupid dolls or Cupid doll illustrations. I just saw them at the Norman Rockwell Museum not too long ago. And when I saw this work, when you sent it in, made me think of those illustrations of hers. Are you familiar with her work, David?
No, I just wrote it down.
Yeah, Rose O'Neill, a woman artist who had these illustrations, or cartoons, I guess you'd call them, of the Cupid dolls. And Dr. Lemieux, are you familiar with her work?
Yeah, she was also sort of a contemporary of Nell Brinkley. So it would have been the early 1900s, 1910, 1920.
Mm-hmm.
And the Cupid dolls, short-lived comic strip, but in terms of pop culture, the dolls themselves became hugely popular.
Yeah, and I'll get to the first question in 1 second.
I do know them. I just looked them up, and I found out about them when I was in Korea because they were just all over the place.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Just a brief thing about that. Your presentation, Dr. Lemieux. I didn't. I grew up reading Blondie, and I never knew Dagwood was a billionaire.
Billionaire.
Yeah, never knew that. So that's something new. Yeah. All right. So our first question. There are actually two questions from Rebecca Seda to all panelists. All panelists is just everybody that's here. So anybody can answer this, I guess. Did the comic strip? Well, this would probably be right to Dr. Lemieux. Did the comic strip artists make a lot of money when they were making them?
Yeah, in the early, if you have a popular comic strip that's syndicated in 1,500, 2,000, 2,600 newspapers globally, yes, you're making a considerable amount of money today, even in the early part of the 20th century, which, you weren't global at that point, but it wasn't uncommon for them to be making over $100,000 a year. And that's just in this, their characters would show up in vaudeville and stage, be commercialized. So they made a considerable amount of money outside of comic strips as well. But you're talking probably a 5 to 10 comic strip artists that had that ability to make that kind of money.
Yeah,
but that's a significant amount of money in
Yeah.
1910, 1915, 1920. Significant amount of money.
And I would imagine getting syndication was pretty tricky and difficult.
Correct. And the interesting part is you did not even own your own comic strips up until like 1917, 1918. The newspaper owned your work. So.
And I also wonder if, in the early 20th century, how many comic artists were out there compared to like today, where David might be able to tell us, since he's in this kind of field and going to comic exhibitions or showing his work at Comic-Con and stuff like that. How many there are out there trying to get syndication or going these alternate routes? So in the early 20th century, were there a lot of comic artists trying to get the syndication, or was it kind of a smaller world then?
I think it was definitely a smaller world then, because you didn't have what we would label today as the underground comic strip world, underground comics world, which, if you put the sort of traditional and underground on a seesaw, I think the underground would there's just so much underground content out there now that doesn't make its way into mainstream newspapers. And David can probably speak to that as well in terms of the amount of, or maybe even Steph, the amount of underground material that's out there. And that wasn't something that even existed in the early part of the 20th century.
Yeah, like there's, what I was talking about, like similar to like Magic Bullet and Resistance. Well, Resistance is part of it, but they have, what's it called in New York? Desert Island Comics. That's by like the person who does Mouse and like I think the Woman in the New Yorker, and they're getting every big name, and it's a free comic they just pass around the city that New York sort of like pays for the citizens. So it's it just covers the entire spectrum. It's huge.
Yeah. Another question from Rebecca was there a reason why the comic was just black and white for Blondie?
Sure. During the week, your comic strip shows up in black and white, and it's smaller. It's probably 4 or 5 panels. And then on Sunday, that color supplement, that's when you created your color work and larger and so forth. But all the daily stuff is in black and white, and that's ink. So if you think about how much you think about Blondie, which is still in existence today, 1930, and that runs 365 days a year, and multiply that by, since 1930, well, that'd be 70, 90 years. 90 times 365, you get an idea of just how much Blondie artwork has been created since it debuted in 1930.
Well, and that brings up a side question. Obviously, the original artist isn't still making the
No,
So
no.
how did it get passed on?
His son, Chick Young, was the originator, and he ran it until, I want to say, the 70s, and then his son took it over, and I think his son maybe just recently relinquished it. But the syndicate who owns or syndicates the strip, as long as there's an audience for it, they will replace you when you die. They're more than happy to keep that moneymaker going, not just here in America, but also because Blondie's huge in Europe, very huge in Europe.
Professor Erla is in attendance, and she had a question for David and Steph, and she wanted to know how your day jobs and independent creative practices have been impacted by COVID. And either Steph or David can answer that. So how have your day jobs and independent creative practices been impacted by COVID?
For me, it was a little dramatic in the beginning of the year. When it all first started happening, I did lose my job for a few days, and then, which didn't make sense given the nature of my job, which is graphic and web design, but I was brought back on, and I worked from home for about 3 months, and then they brought us all back in June. Beginning of June, we all went back to the office, and now it's been pretty much normal since that point. We do all of our meetings with clients over Teams, like Zoom. So that has altered, which is pretty cool. But other than that, it was very dramatic the first couple months, and then it shifted back to normal for at least where I work.
David?
Yeah, mine was a little weird. So, COVID hit. I'd actually been on vacation, and I got back the day that it hit and everything shut down. So, I just lucked out across the board. But afterwards, after being at home for about 2 or 3 weeks, a million people were actually contacting me because I work, in a makerspace where you can make potential PPE for the hospital. So tons of people began contacting me about that, and I ended up going in and working 10 to 12-hour days in the makerspace with other departments alone. And actually working with casting is what ended up allowing us to make the PPE that we made. So we were working directly with the hospital. We made, I think, over 5,000 shields or something. I forget, a crazy amount though. And then after that, I was kind of annoyed with my job because no one else was working. So I just drew for 3 months straight. And now I'm sort of back. I go in a few days a week, but I can't be there because I'm sick anyways. So,
Good answers. And if you have more questions, please add to the chat. I have a couple of questions, but I'm going back to when David was saying that the toys, that the nails can come off, and he related it to My Little Pony with the hair. And I just had this image of little girls buying these toe dolls so that they can paint the toenails. I'm surprised they haven't taken off. Is that one of them?
Yeah, hold on. Yeah, so it just comes right off. That's the trick, man.
It's so big.
Yeah, this is my big boy. This is my big toe.
Yeah. So a lot of questions. Here's another one just came up. Are there Christmas lights behind David? Merry Christmas. one of the questions I have to both of you, both of your styles are very, very different. And, the work that you did, Steph, were, done as GIFs, and they're single panels. But in the single panels,
Mhm.
there's a really strong sense of composition, and you're figuring out how to mix text with image. So they're complex compositions, even though it's in a single panel. And David, your comic,
Mhm.
especially the ones with all the panels, are really, really complex. And there's multiple panels and panel styles, and circular panels in in certain parts. So just the complexity of the image, and then figuring out how to put the text in. What's your process to figure out your compositions and get you to that final panel for each of you?
I will say that in a lot of my comics, if you look, kind of like what Robert was saying, there is a throwaway section almost. It really bothers me when I look at it, but there's almost always this like upper caption that's like, this is what I'm figuring out what the story will be or whatever. And then I'm like, okay, cool. And I just like make it crazy, right? I'm able to start piecing it together. But that drives me completely bananas that I have always this like, so don't look for that, but it's there. I also like, one thing about exhibiting online that's really annoying, well, obviously the mess ups with Zoom, but the other thing is like having the actual page on the wall where you could see it before I'm putting it into Photoshop and cleaning it up. Everyone in grad school and stuff would say that was way more interesting than the actual finished piece. And I think a lot of that is because, I'm doing like little sketches and there's little notes with arrows going into like different places and little like layouts that I do because I draw on really big paper, right? So you kind of miss out on all of that, which is the process that I think comic book artists are really into when they look at work.
So there is a lot of
So
thinking for both of you. Go ahead, Steph.
okay. So typically I start with like a little tiny sketch on another piece of paper and do like the rough idea of the pose first, and then from taking all the notes of the different quotes I want to incorporate, then I draw like the little bubbles and have like a reference, and then I draw the main character first and use black all around, and then erase out the bubbles and position just however naturally they fit and how the words fit. So
Do you find your skills as a graphic designer aiding you as you figure out where to put your text, how to scale the text, and whatever?
oh yeah, definitely. Like it's from the stuff I did senior year to now, like design has completely just changed my frame of mind and how I structure it all and like the flow of it.
I think black, like also being only working in black, there's a reason I'm not throwing color in there is because you can, very quickly like do those complex layouts, whereas adding color is just such like a painful thing when speed is the name of the game.
Oh yeah.
I had a question for Steph. When you look at the caricatures, I guess you might call them, of the workers that you worked with, those are solo sort of images. Have you ever thought of, or maybe you mentioned this, created where they're interacting with each other, where the various characters interact with each other?
Mm-hmm. I haven't done it yet, but like I was saying, I love to do a graphic novel because there's just so many like interactions that we've had that I know if I depict them, I can make it over the top. And obviously it would be an exaggerated version of it,
Sure.
just simple moment, but I definitely want to do it. It's just finding the time.
Your analogy to The Office, I thought, was a great analogy in terms of that's kind of what you're depicting in a way. It's fascinating. Yeah. It's fascinating. It really is.
Thank you.
So, we're a little over time, but I think people haven't dropped off yet, so we'll ask a couple more questions. One, since we do have students in attendance, and this will be, this is being recorded, and we'll have it up on the website, so anybody can check it after. Your trajectories after college, like how was it? Like Steph, I know you got a job with the company you interned for, so that was you were pretty much set once you did your internship. David, you went to grad school, and there was no internship, so you had to figure out what to do. How have you felt? Like, what were the trajectories, I guess, for David, and how have you felt about your move in each of your positions? Because I know, Steph, you have taken on new positions in your job. So
Mhm.
tackle that first.
For me,
Go ahead.
I got really lucky in that what I was engaging with way back when grad school was finishing up, which I was actually discouraged from engaging with, was sort of like makerspace culture. I was going to the library and whatnot. And that's how I ended up at the Hirshhorn, which sort of set me off on my professional trajectory. When I was in grad school, just about everyone would say I want to be a teacher, and I was one of the only people who said I didn't want to be a teacher. When asked, I would say I just want to be in the arts, kind of like, you know what I mean? There's so many ways you can be in the arts and still being like influenced by different people. I think that really benefited me because, if you're going, like a lot of my colleagues, I feel like we're kind of just in the program to get that degree so you can become a teacher. And I think art is special in that, like, it really levels the playing field, and it just doesn't necessarily work that way. And so I got lucky, working in makerspaces because it's still an up and coming thing. There's still like more and more jobs available. And more than that for me is it lets me come across tons and tons of artists who want my skills, so I can kind of like barter for that. But also giving me like tools that are just completely unavailable unless you're willing to shell out, money to pay for it. So.
Steph?
Yeah. So for me, yeah. So for me, I did specialize in graphic design in college. So when I got my job, I started as a graphic designer. And luckily on the job, I learned how to do web design, with WordPress, content management, customizing it with CSS. So that helped me to get promoted to graphic and web designer. And this year, kind of hinted at it. There was dramatic stuff happening right before COVID hit. My boss was unfortunately let go. So it was all in disarray. And I did get promoted to creative manager during the summer. So now I manage everything on top of doing the work and finding contractors. So it's just been this like trajectory with all kinds of influences happening in it. So that was kind of my day job right now. But kind of as that progression was happening, doing all the side work, which I mentioned in my bio, Steve read, that really kind of gave me more fulfillment outside of the job as well. So, photography, freelancing, design, all that stuff, it's all allowed me to kind of experiment with my career and seeing what, trajectory comes after this. I don't know if I'll be here at my job for the rest of my life. Maybe I'll become a photographer. Maybe I'll finally do the graphic novel. The future is untold.
Yeah, it's funny, David, when you said everybody was talking about, in grad school, wanting to go on to be like a college professor, and you didn't. And that's, I was the one that was saying, I don't want to be a college professor. And here I am 23 years later. And a lot of the ones that were going to be college professors didn't go that route. So yeah, odd. But you find what works. I got one class teaching painting, and I realized that, I actually liked it. So that job at Hirshhorn, though, that was kind of teaching. You're working with, kids, and you still are basically educating people in the makerspace, I would say, right?
That's what I like, actually. Teaching is misleading. I should say, like, sort of reimagining education is also another like huge interest of mine, and it's something I'm pretty good at by this point. I worked with like the youth at the Hirshhorn. They're at-risk youth. So there's that. In Korea, a lot of it was like North Korean defectors, or like a different culture that I had to assimilate to kind of and like figure out. And then now college kids.
Yeah, and remember, you were one of those. Yeah.
Yeah, they have cooler projects. I mean, granted, they have better projects, but.
Yeah. Dr. Lemieux, do you have any questions for our panelists about their comics or anything?
Well, I was just intrigued. David had mentioned earlier about how the Kewpie dolls were big in Korea. That stuns me. And I don't, I'd be curious, what other sort of, when you're in that foreign culture, what other aspects of American culture did you see over there that they sort of embraced, if you will? I mean, because Kewpie dolls is just not even on my radar. I don't know how it's on the Koreans' radar.
Yeah, it's crazy the swap. I mean, the toy thing is just like it's huge. You go into any restaurant, any business, any home, and they have just toys. Like at least from what I experienced. It's also like clothing was another thing I noticed. That was more in Japan actually. The clothing. I don't know. They just Americans they get along really well. So there's a lot of swapping.
How long? Sorry, Robert, go ahead.
I was going to ask how, in terms of your art, how long, what's the time process it takes for you to create some of that? And some of it's very, very detailed looking. Yeah.
Not long. So by this, I've been drawing for so long. Like drawing it, you can go really quick. That's one reason, I jump between mediums. Doing anything sculptural takes me like forever, and it's so like tedious, sort of this process of like, okay, make the mold, cast it, do the finishing, and it's like working like a computer. Whereas drawing, I can sit down and just kind of go. And by this point, like I think if you draw enough, you just know kind of how to move quick, and the steps.
And I guess the final question I'd have for both of you, if you could hang out for a day with any artist, who would you hang out with for the day?
Oh. I don't know.
First, hold on. I actually wrote notes where I have artists that I like written down.
Prepared. I'm not prepared.
Yeah, I know. I like over.
I'm not prepared.
While you're thinking, this reminds me of a question I got when I was interviewing for positions at a college art association. In one of the interviews, I got asked, who are your favorite painters? And blank. I couldn't think of anyone because they asked, out of nowhere. And I'm just like, so after that, I started writing them down in my sketchbook, and I would bring that with me, and I would look at it right before interviews, so it didn't get caught off guard again.
Well, it's funny because, comic book artists, I've met a lot of big comic book artists because I've been in conventions and talked to them. Mm-hmm. So if I was gonna do, I would do Lemieux or something. That'd be so cool, knowing someone from back then. That would be right. You don't get that. You can't do that nowadays. No. If I'm taking your
the question. Only person I can think of, I'd hang out with Frida Kahlo because she's super confident with that unibrow. That's the only thing I can think of. It's a terrible answer. I'm so sorry, but
it's an honest answer. All right. Yes, in the chat, yes, Frida from Rebecca. All right.
I didn't want to put you on the spot. I was just curious, if you ever think about, who you would show your work to. You're right. If you had the opportunity, who would I show my work to if I ever ran into them, or who would I'd like to chat with about my work, or I'm just always curious who aspires us or inspires us, perhaps.
Yeah, I was going to segue into that as a final question. Another one to put you on the spot. Do you look at artists outside of comic-related artists that influence you, your drawing style or your compositional style?
Yeah, man, I do. Legos are so awesome. There's certain video games too. Especially now, using video game platforms to even figure out physics of your character, or movement, with animation, stuff like that. Can't go wrong.
I say most of my influence, to be honest, comes from social media. So since I do a lot of photography, I follow ton of photographers, and I feel like that might bleed a little bit into my work, just compositionally speaking. And then I do follow a few artists, which now that my brain is clear, I can think about it. I can't remember their name. Wow. It's a couple that does comic books based on their life, kind of similar to what I'm doing. You know what? Let me find it. They are from Israel, I think. And all their comics are based on the antics between them. It's like different topics like sex, marriage. They have a daughter now, so she's featured in all of their comic books too. So I can see the connection there, and I find a lot of inspiration for them. And I will get the name so I can tell you, but I can't remember it. Their comics, I think, is called One of Those Days.
One of those days.
And they do series.
That's a great title.
Yeah.
Because you can do anything with that title, you know what I mean?
Yeah. It's Yehuda and Maya Devere. And they have a ton of volumes of One of Those Days. It's great stuff. It's so funny, and it's in the comic book style.
You follow them on Instagram or?
Yeah, I follow both of them.
Okay. All right. Well, I'd like to thank our panelists and our attendees that stayed with us as we went 36 minutes over our scheduled hour. I hope people are still there and didn't fall asleep. And I just got a response from Rebecca, so she's thanking us very much. So she is still there. But again, I want to thank everybody for attending. I think that it was just a great conversation. Thank you to Dr. Lemieux for the history of comics, and I love the way you broke it down into those 4 sections that definitely resonate with what's going on in our contemporary culture. And that's the great thing about, I think, comics. It does reference our culture, is maybe better than a lot of mediums. They can really resonate with our day-to-day lives. Thank you again to Dr. Lemieux, Steph Perez, and David Ross. And this recording will be up on the Esther Pringley Rice Gallery website. So have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Steph. Enjoyed it.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
See you, Steve.
Yeah, see you, Robert.